My name is Stella Whitmore. I'm 36 years old, and for most of my adult life, I've been described with words like steady, dependable, and low maintenance. I live in Portland, Oregon, where I work as a senior compliance analyst for a mid-sized healthcare company. My job is to notice details that other people overlook. Discrepancies, patterns, quiet irregularities are buried under confident assumptions. At family gatherings, though, none of that seemed to matter. In my family, I was the easy one, the daughter who didn't make scenes, the sister who never argued over money, the one who would smooth things over when voices tightened at the dinner table. My older brother, Daniel, was the charismatic one, confident, assertive, the natural executor of decisions no one else wanted to make. When our grandfather passed away, Daniel stepped forward before anyone asked him to. He offered to handle the estate. He said it would be simpler that way, less stressful for everyone. And I nodded. This story isn't about explosive confrontations or dramatic courtroom confessions. It's about something much quieter. It's about what happens when you are underestimated for so long that people forget you are paying attention. It's about what it means to follow the numbers when the story you're being told doesn't quite add up. My brother believed I would walk away from my share of our grandfather's estate. Not because he said it outright, but because he assumed I wouldn't challenge him. He assumed I valued peace more than principle. He assumed I wouldn't look too closely. He was wrong. What unfolded over the next year wasn't loud. There were no shouting matches, no threats, no slammed doors. There were spreadsheets, bank statements, a forensic accountant with kind eyes and a precise voice. There were long evenings at my kitchen table with a yellow legal pad and a calculator. There was also grief and disappointment, and the slow realization that sometimes the people who expect the least resistance from you are the ones who benefit most from your silence. I didn't set out to destroy my brother. I didn't want revenge. I wanted clarity. I wanted fairness. I wanted the truth about what had happened to the money that was meant to be shared. This is the story of how I followed the money and what I found when I did. It's about quiet dominance, about choosing strategy over outrage, about discovering that integrity, when applied patiently, can be more powerful than anger ever could be. If you've ever been the person everyone assumes will just let it go, you might recognize parts of yourself here. Have you ever noticed how differently people treat you when they think you won't push back? In my family, I was the reasonable one. That was the label. It sounded like a compliment. And for a long time, I wore it like one. When my brother Daniel and I were kids, he negotiated everything: bedtimes, allowances, curfews. He would argue his case like a young attorney, complete with dramatic sighs and well-timed silences. I, on the other hand, would listen. I would weigh, I would concede. Not because I agreed, but because I calculated the cost of resistance. By the time we were adults, the dynamic had settled into something predictable. Daniel spoke first. Daniel volunteered. Daniel decided. I supported. I adjusted. I absorbed. At family dinners, if there was a disagreement about politics or investments or how something should be done, everyone would turn to Daniel as if he were the unofficial authority. He worked in real estate development, confident, visible, risk-friendly. He drove a German car and used phrases like leveraging opportunity. I worked in compliance. In rooms where charisma is currency, compliance sounds like paperwork. When our grandfather fell ill, it was Daniel who started attending doctor appointments. Daniel who spoke to the attorney about updating the will. Daniel who reassured our mother that he would handle everything. No one questioned it, not because they trusted him more than me, exactly, but because they trusted him to act. And they trusted me not to interfere. That distinction matters. At the reading of the will, I remember sitting very still. The attorney spoke carefully, respectfully. My grandfather had divided his estate evenly between Daniel and me. The house was to be sold. The investment accounts were liquidated and distributed. It was straightforward, clean. Daniel squeezed my shoulder and whispered, "Don't worry, I'll take care of it." And I said, "Okay." That okay defined how they saw me. To them, I was the sister who didn't care much about money, the one who had a stable job, a modest lifestyle, no children, and no dramatic expenses, the one who would be fine no matter what. What they didn't see was how closely I listened when numbers were mentioned, how automatically my mind mapped timelines and obligations, how, even while nodding, I was noting. They thought my silence meant indifference. It was actually an observation. Over the next few months, Daniel gave periodic updates. The house had a few offers. The market was tricky. There were tax implications that needed careful navigation. He used language that sounded complex enough to discourage questions. Our mother would sigh with relief and say how grateful she was that Daniel was managing it. She would glance at me and add, "And Stella's so easy about these things. She's never been materialistic." I would smile. It's strange how often being self-sufficient is interpreted as being undeserving of protection. No one asked if I had reviewed the estate documents. No one asked if I wanted joint access to the accounts during probate. It was simply assumed that Daniel's oversight was efficient and that I trusted him implicitly. To be fair, at first I did. He was my brother. We had shared bedrooms during vacations, whispered jokes at funerals, and defended each other in schoolyard arguments. Trust felt less like a choice and more like a default setting. But beneath that trust, there was something else. A faint, almost imperceptible tension, not suspicion, just awareness. Because in my professional life, I had learned something critical. When one person controls all the information flow, transparency becomes optional. And optional transparency is rarely neutral. Still, I said nothing. I didn't want to be the difficult sibling. I didn't want to appear distrustful in the middle of grief. I didn't want to disrupt the narrative that I was the calm one, the reasonable one, the one who understood that these things take time. In their eyes, I was safe, predictable, unthreatening. They had no idea how dangerous a quiet person can become when she starts to pay attention. The first time something felt off, it was small enough to ignore. That's why it worked. About 3 months after the will was read, Daniel called me on a Tuesday evening. I remember because I was standing in my kitchen, stirring lentil soup, watching rain beat against the window. "Good news," he said, upbeat. "We've got a buyer for Grandpa's house." I felt a quiet wave of relief. The house had been sitting empty, and every week it remained unsold meant utilities, insurance, and property taxes. I'd been tracking the general market out of habit, but I hadn't asked him for specifics. "That's great," I said. "What did it go for?" There was a half-second pause, barely noticeable, but I noticed pauses. "Just under asking," he replied. "Market's cooling a bit, but it's solid." Just under asking. I knew the listing price. I'd looked it up the day it went live. I also knew comparable sales in the neighborhood had closed slightly above asking in the past 2 months. "Do you know the final number?" I asked, keeping my tone light. Another pause. "This one is shorter." "I'll send you the closing summary when everything settles," he said. "There are still a few adjustments. You know how escrow works." I do know how escrow works. In my job, when someone defers specifics with procedural language, it's usually because specifics are inconvenient. But I let it go. 2 weeks later, he transferred what he described as a partial distribution to my account. The amount was lower than I expected. Not dramatically lower, not outrageously wrong, just enough to create a faint pressure behind my ribs. I opened a spreadsheet that night. I listed the known assets from the will, estimated home value, 2 investment accounts, and a small life insurance policy. I deducted reasonable costs, probate fees, realtor commission, and taxes. Then I compared the theoretical net to the distribution I'd received. The gap wasn't massive, but it existed. I told myself I was being paranoid. Grief does strange things to perception. Maybe there were capital gains I hadn't considered. Maybe Daniel had fronted expenses and reimbursed himself. Maybe there were repairs on the house before closing. Maybe. That's how small cuts work. They don't bleed enough to justify an alarm. A few days later, at Sunday dinner, our mother thanked Daniel again for handling everything so smoothly. She asked if there was anything I needed to sign. "No, Stella's good," Daniel answered before I could speak. "I've got it covered." I smiled across the table at him. He smiled back, warm, brotherly, unbothered. It wasn't what he said. It was he who answered for me. Later that evening, I texted him casually. "Hey, when you have a chance, could you forward the closing statement from the house sale? Just for my records." He responded an hour later. "Of course, it's a long PDF, but I'll dig it up tomorrow." Tomorrow came. Nothing. I didn't follow up, not because I forgot, but because I was observing. In compliance, there's a concept called pattern emergence. 1 missed document means nothing. 2 missed documents suggest oversight. 3 begin to signal intention. At that point, I had 1 missed document and a number that didn't quite align. I could have pressed harder. I could have called. I could have insisted. Instead, I waited, because sometimes the most revealing thing you can do is give someone the opportunity to correct themselves and see if they choose to. He didn't send the PDF, and that was the first small cut. It didn't hurt enough to confront, but it hurt enough to remember. After the first missing PDF, I told myself a story. Daniel is busy. Real estate deals move fast. You don't want to micromanage him. This is grief, not fraud. The mind is remarkably skilled at protecting relationships from discomfort. 2 weeks later, I asked again, this time over the phone. "Oh, right," he said lightly. "I've been slammed. I'll send it tonight." He didn't. What's interesting isn't that he forgot. It's that he forgot twice without apology, as if the information didn't really belong to me. That's when I noticed the subtle shift in tone during our conversations. Whenever I asked about numbers, Daniel responded with summaries instead of documents. "It's roughly this. Ballpark, we're looking at that. After fees and adjustments, it nets out fine. Fine is not a number." In my professional life, if someone gives me adjectives instead of figures, I ask again. I document the exchange. I escalate if necessary. With my brother, I softened. I didn't want to become the suspicious sister, the difficult one, the one who turned inheritance into conflict. So I normalized it. When he said, "Trust me, it's handled," I nodded, even if he couldn't see me over the phone. When he described unexpected costs, I accepted them without invoices. When months passed without a final accounting, I reassured our mother that these things take time. The truth is, I was protecting everyone else from discomfort, and slowly that protection became permission. At Thanksgiving, Daniel brought up an investment opportunity he was excited about, a small commercial property outside the city. He described it enthusiastically, outlining projected returns and renovation plans. "Timing's everything," he said. "When you see an opportunity, you move." I watched him as he spoke, confident, animated, certain. I wondered briefly how he was funding it, then I hated myself for wondering. Because suspicion feels like betrayal when it's aimed at someone you grew up loving. Later that night, after dishes were done and leftovers packed away, I opened my spreadsheet again. I updated it with the partial distribution I'd received. I adjusted for more conservative sales assumptions. I tried to make the numbers reconcile. They still didn't. The gap hadn't closed. It had widened, not dramatically, not in a way that would make headlines, but enough that, if this were a compliance review at work, I would have flagged it for internal audit. Instead, I closed the laptop. I told myself something else. If there's an issue, it will surface eventually. There's no need to create tension prematurely. That's how disrespect becomes normalized. Not through overt harm, but through repeated minimization. Daniel began to speak about the estate as if it were already fully resolved. "Once everything wraps up," he'd say, after I finished the last transfers. Last transfers, plural. I had only received one. When I mentioned that gently, "I've only seen the first distribution," he responded with a laugh. "Relax, Stella, you'll get what's yours. You'll get what's yours." It was meant to reassure. Instead, it revealed something deeper. He no longer saw the estate as a shared responsibility. He saw it as something he was dispensing. And I was the recipient, not the co-heir, not the equal beneficiary, the quiet sister who would eventually be satisfied. That was the moment I understood something uncomfortable. This wasn't just about delayed paperwork. It was about perception. He believed I wouldn't push. And the more I stayed silent to preserve peace, the more that belief solidified into certainty. Disrespect rarely begins as cruelty. It begins as an assumption, and I had been complicit in reinforcing it. But complicity is not permanent. It's a phase, and phases can end. There's a quiet moment in every family where roles stop being temporary and start becoming permanent. I didn't notice when mine solidified, but once I saw it, I couldn't unsee it. I was the stabilizer, the one who didn't demand updates, the one who didn't question timing, the one who trusted processes she wasn't allowed to see. Daniel was the executor in everything but title. He scheduled the realtor. He spoke to the attorney. He communicated with the financial advisor who had managed our grandfather's modest investment accounts. When relatives asked how things were progressing, he answered confidently. When they turned to me, I confirmed his version. It was seamless. At Christmas, my aunt pulled me aside in the hallway. "You're lucky to have a brother who takes initiative like that," she said warmly. "Some families fall apart over estates." I smiled. "Yes, we're fortunate." Fortunate. The word echoed in my mind later that night, because here's what no one noticed. I had never been given access to the estate accounts directly. I had never been copied on correspondence with the attorney. Every update I received came filtered through Daniel. Not because I couldn't request it, but because I hadn't. And in families, what you don't request becomes what you don't deserve. One evening, our mother mentioned casually that Daniel had stopped by to sign some final paperwork related to the investments. I paused. "Final paperwork?" "Oh, nothing major," she said quickly. "Just tax forms." Daniel said it was routine. Daniel said. I wasn't included in that routine. When I asked him about it the next day, he brushed it off. "Just standard liquidation stuff. I didn't want to overwhelm you with documents. You hate admin." "I hate admin." I almost laughed. My entire career revolves around regulatory documentation. But he wasn't speaking about facts. He was speaking about identity. The identity he had assigned me, the sister who preferred simplicity over scrutiny. In that role, asking for details would seem out of character, suspicious, even ungrateful. So I studied the role instead. Reliable, supportive, financially independent enough not to need the money urgently, emotionally stable enough not to challenge authority, invisible enough not to threaten control. It wasn't malicious in an obvious way. Daniel likely didn't wake up thinking, how can I marginalize my sister today? It was subtler than that. He simply stepped into the space available, and I had left it open. One Sunday afternoon, I visited our grandfather's old house one last time before the new owners moved in. Daniel had already handled the sale. The keys were no longer ours. I stood in the empty living room where we used to build blanket forts. Grandpa would sit in his recliner and tell long, winding stories about his early years. That house wasn't just property. It was history. And suddenly, the fact that I had never seen the final sale documents felt heavier. Not because of the money, because of what it symbolized. I had been present for every memory in that house. Yet I was absent from the transaction that closed it. That's when the realization settled fully. The role I'd been assigned wasn't accidental. It was convenient. For Daniel to maintain control, someone had to be comfortable not controlling. I had been that someone. But roles are only binding if you continue performing them. And for the first time, standing in that empty room, I felt something shift. Not anger, not outrage, just clarity. I didn't want conflict, but I no longer wanted invisibility. And the two, I was beginning to understand, are not the same thing. The shift didn't happen during an argument. It didn't happen when Daniel dismissed another question or when another document failed to appear. It happened on a quiet Wednesday night, alone at my kitchen table. I had just finished reviewing a routine compliance report for work. Pages of transaction logs, timestamps, and approval chains. My job requires one simple discipline: assume nothing, verify everything. After I closed my work laptop, I opened my personal one. I don't know what made me do it that night instead of the dozens before. Maybe it was fatigue. Maybe it was the accumulation of small evasions. Maybe it was the memory of standing in our grandfather's empty living room, realizing I had signed nothing yet lost something. I opened the county property records website. The house sale had closed 6 weeks earlier. That much I knew. What I didn't know was the final recorded sale price. It took less than 3 minutes to find. The number on the screen was higher than Daniel had implied. Not astronomically, not scandalously, just definitely. I sat very still. My first instinct was to rationalize. Maybe there were seller concessions. Maybe closing credits adjusted the net. Maybe taxes consumed more than I'd calculated. So I did what I always do when something doesn't align. I built a model. I pulled comparable commission structures, estimated transfer taxes, calculated worst-case closing costs. Even with generous assumptions, the gap remained. Larger now. Not a misunderstanding. A difference. I leaned back in my chair and stared at the ceiling. The feeling wasn't fury, it wasn't heartbreak. It was something quieter and colder. Recognition. Because at that moment, a question formed that I could no longer push aside. If the house number didn't match, what else didn't? That question changed everything. Until then, I had been evaluating Daniel's behavior in isolation. Missed PDF, vague updates, casual reassurances. Now I saw a pattern. Information withheld. Figures are summarized instead of shared. Authority assumed without verification. He thought I wasn't checking. He thought my silence meant acceptance. He thought that because I valued peace, I would never test the story. And suddenly I understood something critical. This wasn't about catching him in a lie. It was about deciding whether I was willing to live inside one. I closed the laptop gently. No dramatic gestures, no late-night phone calls, no accusatory texts. Instead, I wrote one sentence on a yellow legal pad. Obtain full accounting independently. Not confront, not accuse. Obtain. There's power in choosing verbs carefully. That night, I didn't sleep much. But not because I was anxious. Because I was recalibrating. For years, my strength had been restraint. Emotional regulation. The ability to absorb without reacting. But restraint without boundaries becomes permission. And I had just discovered that my boundaries were theoretical. The shift wasn't explosive. It was structural. I stopped asking Daniel for documents. I stopped waiting for voluntary transparency. And I began asking myself a different question. If this were any other situation, any other person, what would a competent, self-respecting professional do? The answer was simple. She would verify, and she would do it quietly. That was the night I stopped being the easy sister. Daniel didn't know it yet, but the dynamic had already changed. After that Wednesday night, my silence felt different. Before it had been reflexive, an instinct to smooth, to preserve, to avoid unnecessary friction. Now it was deliberate. There's a subtle but profound difference between not speaking because you feel small and not speaking because you are gathering strength. Daniel continued his updates as usual, casual, confident, light on specifics. Still finalizing the investment account transfers, he said during one phone call. Markets have been volatile, so timing matters. I responded the same way I always had, calm, agreeable. Of course, just let me know when it's done. If he noticed any change in my tone, he didn't show it. But internally, everything had shifted. Instead of interpreting his words at face value, I began cataloging them. Dates, claims, timelines. I kept notes. Not because I was building a case yet, but because clarity requires memory, and memory is unreliable without documentation. At Sunday dinner, our mother mentioned that Daniel had recently refinanced his home. He's really stepping up, she said proudly, so proactive with his finances. I nodded. That's great. I didn't ask how a refinance aligned with his recent tight liquidity comments regarding the estate. I didn't ask how he was funding renovation plans for the commercial property he'd mentioned at Thanksgiving. I simply listened. Silence, when intentional, creates space. And in that space, people reveal themselves. Daniel began to speak more freely around me, not less. That surprised me at first, but then I understood why. He believed the risk of scrutiny had passed. He believed my initial mild questions were the extent of my curiosity. He mistook reduced questioning for resolution. That's the paradox of underestimation. Once someone decides you're not a threat, they relax around you. One evening, he made an offhand comment that lingered. You've always been low maintenance, he said with a laugh. I appreciate that. Makes things simpler. Simpler for whom? I smiled politely. In my professional life, I've seen how compliance failures rarely begin with dramatic theft. They begin with rationalizations. I'll adjust it later. They won't notice. It balances out. I deserve this. I didn't know yet whether Daniel had crossed a legal line, but I knew something else with certainty. He had crossed an ethical line. And ethics, unlike law, don't require courtroom proof to matter. Over the next few weeks, I made small, practical moves. I requested copies of our grandfather's original will directly from the attorney's office, not through Daniel. As a named beneficiary, I was entitled to them. The receptionist didn't hesitate. I downloaded publicly available probate filings. I reviewed timelines. I didn't announce any of this, because the moment you signal investigation, behavior changes. And I wasn't ready for behavior to change. I wanted the unguarded version. There's a calm that comes when you stop hoping someone will correct themselves and start preparing for the possibility that they won't. That calm settled over me like a second skin. Daniel thought I had chosen peace. In reality, I had chosen a strategy. He believed I would walk away. What he didn't understand is that walking quietly and walking away are not the same thing. I was still very much present, and I was beginning to follow the money. Preparation rarely looks dramatic from the outside. From Daniel's perspective, nothing had changed. I still showed up to dinner. I still asked about his projects. I still listened more than I spoke. What he never noticed was how methodical my listening had become. The first step wasn't confrontation. It was education. Even though I work in compliance, estate accounting has its own nuances. Probate sequencing, fiduciary duties, and executor obligations. I spent evenings reading case summaries and state statutes, not obsessively, not emotionally, clinically. In our state, an executor, formal or informal, has a fiduciary duty to beneficiaries. That includes transparency, accurate reporting, equal distribution unless otherwise specified. Daniel wasn't officially appointed executor by the court. He had simply assumed operational control with the family's consent. That distinction mattered. Informal control can blur accountability. Next, I built a timeline. Date of death. Date will be filed. Date house listed. Date house closed. Date of partial distribution. Dates of Daniel's finalizing comments. When you lay events side by side, patterns emerge. I requested transaction histories from the investment firm listed in the probate filings. As a beneficiary, I had the right to them. The representative asked for identification and documentation. I provided both. A week later, a secure digital folder arrived in my inbox. I didn't open it immediately. I made tea first. There's something grounding about ritual when you're about to confirm a suspicion. The statements were detailed: dates, transfers, liquidations. I noticed something immediately: a large withdrawal categorized as administrative adjustment 2 weeks before my partial distribution. The amount was significant enough to explain the gap, but not specific enough to explain the purpose. Administrative adjustment is not a destination, it's a placeholder. I cross-referenced the date with my timeline. 2 days after that withdrawal, Daniel had called to say markets were volatile and he was timing distributions carefully. Volatility doesn't create administrative adjustments. Decisions do. I felt a flicker of something, anger perhaps, but it was brief. Emotion clouds precision. I needed precision. So I did something that surprised even me. I didn't call him. I didn't text. I scheduled a consultation with a forensic accountant, not because I was certain of wrongdoing, but because I was no longer willing to rely on my interpretation alone. The firm specialized in financial discrepancies within estates and small partnerships. I chose them deliberately, quiet professionals, not sensational litigators. The accountant I met with was a woman in her early 40s, measured in tone and movement. She didn't dramatize. She asked questions. Has your brother provided full accounting statements? No. Is he a court-appointed executor? No. Have you received equal documented distributions? No. She nodded once. Then we begin with reconciliation. That word, reconciliation, felt important. Not an accusation, not exposure. Reconciliation. Over the next several weeks, I provided her with everything. The will, probate filings, property records, bank statements, email exchanges, and my timeline. While Daniel assumed the estate was quietly concluding, an entirely different process had begun. One he couldn't see. Forensic accounting isn't theatrical, it's patient. It traces funds across accounts. It identifies pathways, not just gaps. And pathways tell stories. Meanwhile, at family gatherings, Daniel remained relaxed, confident. Occasionally even generous, picking up restaurant tabs, discussing renovation ideas. He never asked if I had finally received the rest of my share. He assumed the matter had dissolved. He never noticed that I had stopped asking because I no longer needed his version. Silence had become infrastructure. Underneath it, something far more structured was forming. And for the first time, I felt something unexpected. Not rage, not fear, control, not over him, over myself, over the process, over the truth. He thought I had accepted the narrative. He never imagined I was auditing it. The email from the forensic accountant arrived on a Monday morning. Subject line, preliminary findings, estate reconciliation. I didn't open it immediately. I finished my coffee. I reviewed 2 work memos. I answered a routine compliance inquiry. I wanted my pulse steady before I read what I already suspected might be there. When I finally opened the document, it was 12 pages long. Clear, structured, methodical. No adjectives, just movement of funds. The large administrative adjustment I had noticed wasn't administrative at all. It was a transfer, first into a temporary holding account under Daniel's name, then partially redirected into what appeared to be a newly opened business account tied to his real estate development, LLC. The timing aligned precisely with the down payment window for the commercial property he had mentioned at Thanksgiving. I read that paragraph twice, not because it was confusing, because it was definitive. The accountant had traced the path using transaction identifiers. Dates matched. Amounts matched within dollars. It wasn't a clerical delay. It wasn't market volatility. It was reallocation. My share, half of that adjustment, had never been distributed to me. It had been leveraged. I expected to feel explosive anger. Instead, I felt an eerie stillness. There's a moment when suspicion transforms into evidence. In that moment, emotion often drains away, replaced by clarity. Clarity can feel cold, but it's stabilizing. The report continued. There were smaller discrepancies too. Fees charged to the estate that exceeded standard rates. Reimbursements for property preparation that had no corresponding invoices. Nothing theatrical, nothing that would scream criminality to a casual observer. But collectively, the pattern was undeniable. Funds intended for equal distribution had been temporarily and strategically absorbed into Daniel's financial ecosystem. He hadn't emptied the accounts. He hadn't disappeared with everything. He had simply assumed he could borrow against my silence. He thought I wouldn't track. He thought I wouldn't notice. He thought I valued harmony more than equity. The accountant's final note was restrained. Based on available documentation, beneficiary distributions appear materially unequal. Further legal consultation recommended. Recommended, not required. That word mattered. I wasn't trapped in reaction. I had options. I closed the file and sat back. For a few minutes, I allowed myself to feel the personal layer beneath the financial one. This wasn't just about money. It was about trust recalculated without my consent. About being assessed as low risk. About being treated as a resource rather than an equal. I didn't cry. I didn't call anyone. Instead, I printed the report and placed it in a slim black folder. I labeled it simply, Estate Review. Then I made a list. Legal consultation, formal demand for accounting. Preservation of documentation, no emotional confrontation. The last one was intentional, because once emotion enters the room, people retreat into defensiveness. I didn't want defensiveness. I wanted resolution. Quiet, documented, irreversible. That evening, Daniel called to chat about a potential new tenant for his commercial property. He sounded optimistic, expansive, certain. I listened. I even congratulated him. He had no idea that I knew exactly how that property had been funded. And that was the moment I understood the true leverage wasn't the report itself. It was timing. I didn't need to expose him publicly. I didn't need to humiliate him. I needed to decide when and how the truth would enter the room, because once it did, nothing would return to its previous shape. He thought I'd walk away. Instead, I had followed the money, and now I held the map. Evidence creates a crossroads. Once you know, you can't unknow. Once you see the full pattern, neutrality becomes a choice, not an accident. For 3 days, I did nothing. I went to work, I attended meetings, I reviewed compliance frameworks and policy drafts. On the surface, my life looked unchanged. Internally, I was evaluating outcomes. Option 1, confront Daniel privately, show him the report. Give him a chance to correct it quietly. Option 2, send a formal demand letter through an attorney requesting a full accounting and equal distribution. Option 3, file a petition in probate court alleging breach of fiduciary duty. Each path carried consequences. Private confrontation might preserve family optics, but it would rely again on his willingness to self-correct. I had already tested that variable. The result was clear. Immediate legal action would escalate quickly. It would create defensiveness, fracture relationships, and potentially pull our mother into stress she didn't deserve. The demand letter sat in the middle, structured, formal, documented, not emotional. I asked myself a question I use at work when policies collide. What outcome do you want 5 years from now? Not next week, not next month. 5 years. Did I want to say I protected peace at the cost of principle? Or did I want to say I enforced fairness without cruelty? Because this wasn't about punishing Daniel. It was about correcting the ledger. There's a difference. On the 4th morning, I scheduled a consultation with an estate attorney. I brought the forensic report, the probate documents, and my timeline. He reviewed everything carefully. This is clean, he said finally. You've documented thoroughly. If we proceed, we request formal accounting first. It gives him an opportunity to remedy without litigation. If he refuses, we escalate. Remedy without litigation. That aligned with my moral code. I didn't want spectacles. I wanted structure. What happens if he claims it was a temporary loan, I asked. The attorney looked at me steadily. Then he would need documentation showing beneficiary consent. Do you recall giving consent? No. Then the burden shifts to him. Burden shifts. For months, I had carried the invisible burden of doubt, the discomfort of suspicion, the weight of appearing ungrateful. Now the burden could shift back to the person who moved the funds. That afternoon, I authorized the attorney to draft a formal demand for full accounting and reconciliation within 30 days. Not an accusation, a requirement. The letter would reference statutory beneficiary rights. It would request documentation for all withdrawals, adjustments, fees, and transfers. It would cite the discrepancy identified in preliminary review without disclosing every traced pathway. Precision, not provocation. Before the letter was sent, I sat alone in my living room and allowed myself one final moment of hesitation. Once this is mailed, the dynamic changes permanently. There would be no returning to the easy sister narrative, no pretending oversight, no casual Sunday dinners untouched by subtext. But something else was true. The dynamic had already changed the night I found the property sale number. The illusion was already broken. Sending the letter wouldn't destroy peace. It would simply expose that peace had been conditional. I signed the authorization electronically. The attorney confirmed. The letter will be delivered via certified mail tomorrow. Tomorrow, I didn't feel triumphant. I felt aligned. He thought I would walk away. Instead, I chose the irreversible path, the one built on documentation, not emotion. And once a formal demand enters the record, silence stops being protection. It becomes evidence. The letter was sent on a Thursday morning. Certified, return receipt requested. There's something almost ceremonial about certified mail. It transforms emotion into a record. It says, this is no longer a conversation, it's documentation. Daniel didn't call that day. He didn't text, which told me one of two things. Either he hadn't received it yet, or he had, and he was recalibrating. I went about my routine. At work, I led a compliance review meeting. I explained to a department head why documentation gaps, even small ones, create regulatory exposure. As I spoke, I was acutely aware of the symmetry. Transparency is simple until it isn't. That evening, Daniel finally called. His voice was controlled. "Hey," he said casually. "Got something interesting in the mail today." I let a small pause sit between us. "Yes," I replied evenly. I thought it was time to formalize things. Another pause. "You could have just talked to me," he said. There it was. The pivot to informality. The suggestion that process equals betrayal. "I did talk to you," I answered calmly. "Several times. I asked for documentation. I didn't receive it." Silence, then slightly sharper. "So you hired people?" "I requested reconciliation," I corrected. "That's different." He exhaled slowly. Not anger, not yet. More like calculation. "You're making this bigger than it needs to be." That sentence landed exactly as I expected. I kept my tone neutral. If everything is aligned, the accounting will reflect that. No accusation, no raised voice. Just structure. He didn't argue further. He ended the call quickly, too quickly. That told me something important. He hadn't expected resistance. Over the next week, subtle shifts began. Daniel stopped volunteering updates entirely. At Sunday dinner, he was quieter, more measured. He avoided financial topics. Our mother sensed tension but didn't understand it. I didn't involve her. I wouldn't use her as leverage, and I wouldn't let her be used as a shield. Meanwhile, my attorney received a brief email response from Daniel. He claimed the transfer had been a temporary liquidity maneuver related to estate timing, and that full reconciliation was in progress. In progress. The phrase again. But this time, it was in writing. And writing changes the stakes. 30 days is a long time when documentation is required. The forensic accountant remained on standby. We preserved records. We secured transaction histories before anything could be retroactively altered. That's the thing about quiet action. Most people don't realize how much has already been locked in place before they begin reacting. Daniel thought he still had time to manage the narrative. What he didn't realize was that timelines were now external, statutory, documented, irreversible. 2 weeks in, a partial transfer hit my account, larger than the first. No explanation attached, no apology, just numbers. I didn't acknowledge it directly. Instead, my attorney replied formally, requesting a complete accounting for all prior movements, including documentation for the temporary liquidity maneuver. Because repayment without transparency isn't a resolution, it's containment. Daniel's confidence began to thin in small, almost invisible ways. Shorter messages, delayed replies, less certainty in tone. Not because I was attacking him, because the structure was. He thought I would walk away. Instead, I moved in silence, securing documentation, preserving rights, letting process do what emotion never could. And the most powerful part? I never raised my voice. Consequences rarely announce themselves. They begin as subtle contractions, a tightening of options, a narrowing of timelines, a shift in tone. 2 weeks after the partial repayment, Daniel's commercial property deal began to wobble. I didn't hear that directly from him. I heard it from our mother. "He's under a lot of stress," she said one evening over the phone. Something about investors asking more questions than usual. I listened quietly. Investors ask questions when numbers don't reconcile, when liquidity appears inconsistent, when documentation trails feel thin. Structure ripples outward. Daniel had likely assumed the estate funds were temporary leverage, bridging capital he could replace once the property stabilized. But when I introduced formal accounting requirements, liquidity stopped being flexible. It became traceable. At Sunday dinner, Daniel looked different. Not defeated, not angry, just compressed. His usual expansiveness was gone. He didn't describe bold projections or renovation timelines. He spoke cautiously, as if every statement needed internal review before release. For the first time in months, he asked me a direct question. "So, what exactly are you looking for?" he said carefully. "Complete accounting," I answered. "That's all." He nodded slowly. "You know this makes things complicated." "I imagine it does," I said evenly. There was no satisfaction in my voice. Because this wasn't about watching him struggle. It was about watching reality reassert itself. Over the next several days, my attorney received additional documentation, bank statements, partial invoices, and summaries. But gaps remained. The forensic accountant reviewed the new material and highlighted inconsistencies. Transfers that were labeled retroactively. Expenses that lacked third-party verification. Nothing explosive, just incomplete. And incomplete in a legal context is exposure. Daniel began sending longer emails, explanatory in tone. He described the transfer as a short-term estate management strategy. He emphasized intention over documentation. Intention doesn't replace consent. I noticed something else too. He stopped framing the estate as something he was handling, He started calling it the situation. Language shifts when control weakens. Our mother finally asked me directly one afternoon, "Is something wrong between you and your brother?" I chose my words carefully. "We're resolving some paperwork issues," I said. "It's procedural." That was true. It was procedural, but procedure has power. Daniel's frustration surfaced once, not in shouting, but in a strained voicemail. "You didn't have to involve lawyers," he said. "We could have figured this out." We, that word again. We only existed when decisions flowed through him. When accountability entered, it became you. I didn't respond emotionally. Instead, my attorney replied formally to his latest submission, noting outstanding items still required for compliance. Each unanswered question tightened the circle. The commercial property investors, I later learned, had requested additional proof of capital sourcing. They wanted assurance that no encumbrances existed. Encumbrances, a legal claim, a pending dispute. Even the possibility complicates financing. I hadn't contacted them. I didn't need to. Documentation creates its own gravity, and gravity pulls. Daniel began to understand something he hadn't anticipated. Silence does not mean absence. Structure does not mean hostility. And fairness, once formalized, doesn't negotiate with charm. The consequences had begun, not because I attacked him, but because I stopped absorbing what wasn't mine to carry. By the time Daniel asked to just sit down and talk, the window for informal resolution had already narrowed. Not closed, but narrowed enough that intention alone couldn't reopen it. He came to my apartment on a Tuesday evening. No audience, no family buffer, just the two of us at my dining table. The same place where I had first written obtain full accounting independently. He looked tired, not ruined, not desperate. "Just aware. I didn't think you'd go this far," he said quietly. There was no accusation in his tone this time, just recognition. "I didn't think I'd need to," I replied. That was the closest I came to emotional honesty. He leaned back in his chair, hands clasped. "It was temporary. I was covering timing gaps. I was going to balance it once the property stabilized." "Did you tell me that?" I asked. "No." "Did I consent to it?" He didn't answer immediately. "No." Silence settled between us. He wasn't denying the transfer anymore. He wasn't reframing it as volatility or an administrative adjustment. He was confronting the core issue. Control without permission. "I was managing everything," he said finally. It felt efficient. Efficient. That word again. Efficiency is attractive when you're the one benefiting from it. "But it wasn't transparent," I said. He rubbed his forehead. "I didn't think you'd question it." There it was. Not malice. Assumption. He had calculated risk, and I had been categorized as low risk. "I'm not questioning you," I said calmly. "I'm reconciling numbers." He looked at me then, not as the easy sister, not as the quiet stabilizer, as an equal. The problem was, by that point, reconciliation wasn't a private agreement between siblings. It was documented. Attorneys were involved. Deadlines were active. Investors were asking questions. He had already submitted partial explanations in writing. Inconsistencies had been flagged. Once documentation exists, it can't be unwritten with an apology. "I can transfer the remaining amount," he said. "We can close this." "Transfer with full accounting," I corrected gently. "That's the requirement." He nodded slowly. "I didn't think you'd push." "I didn't either," I admitted. That was the most honest sentence of the night, because the shift hadn't just surprised him. It had surprised me. Over the next 2 weeks, Daniel worked quickly. Statements were finalized. Missing invoices appeared. Full distribution, principal plus accrued investment gains, was transferred to my account. Clean, documented, balanced. But something else had also shifted. Something less tangible and less reversible. Trust doesn't return with repayment. It recalibrates. At Sunday dinner, our conversations were polite, measured. No one raised a voice. No public accusations surfaced. From the outside, nothing dramatic had happened. But inside the structure of our relationship, the hierarchy had dissolved. He no longer assumed authority, and I no longer performed compliance without verification. Too late to fix it? Not financially. That was resolved. But relational dynamics, once exposed, don't revert to their previous shape. They evolve or they distance, and for the first time, I wasn't afraid of either outcome. The final confrontation didn't happen in my apartment. It happened at our mother's house 3 weeks after the full reconciliation was completed. Sunday dinner, roast chicken, familiar table, familiar chairs. From the outside, it looked like every other gathering we'd had for years. But this time, nothing invisible remained. After we finished eating, Daniel cleared his throat. "I owe Stella something," he said. Our mother looked between us, confused. Daniel didn't look at her. He looked at me. "I handled the estate poorly," he said evenly. "I moved funds without full disclosure. That was wrong." The word wrong felt deliberate. Not mistaken, not misunderstood. Wrong. Our mother's face shifted, surprise, then concern. What does that mean? She asked. It means everything's resolved, I said gently before emotion could spiral. The accounting is complete, the distributions are equal, there's no dispute. That was important. No public spectacle, no humiliation. Daniel continued, his voice steady but lower than usual. I assumed Stella wouldn't question it, he said. I shouldn't have made that assumption. There was no heat in the room, no raised tones, just recalibration happening in real time. Our mother exhaled slowly. I didn't realize there was an issue. There isn't anymore, I said. Daniel nodded, because she made it one. That sentence could have carried resentment. It didn't. It carried acknowledgement. He wasn't apologizing in the dramatic way people do when they want forgiveness quickly. He wasn't emotional. He was adjusting his understanding of me. I thought I was being efficient, he added. I wasn't being fair. I met his eyes. I don't need an apology, I said quietly. I needed transparency. That was the truth. Anger would have been easier, cleaner, louder. But anger isn't what restructures dynamics. Boundaries do. Daniel nodded once. I understand that now. And something subtle passed between us. Not reconciliation in the sentimental sense, but equilibrium. For the first time in our adult lives, there was no imbalance of information, no assumption of authority, no invisible hierarchy. Just two adults sitting at the same table. After dinner, while our mother washed dishes, Daniel stood beside me at the kitchen counter. You surprise me, he said softly. I surprise myself, I replied. He gave a small, almost reluctant smile. I won't underestimate you again. I didn't respond with pride. I responded calmly. That's not necessary, I said. Just don't exclude me. That was the entire confrontation. No shouting, no dramatic exits, no broken plates or severed relationships. Just a correction. Sometimes, quiet dominance isn't about overpowering someone. It's about removing the illusion that you can be overpowered, and once that illusion is gone, conversation changes. He had thought I would walk away. Instead, I had followed the money without raising my voice. And that, more than anything, reset the room. People assume that moments like this transform you into someone harder, colder, more guarded, less trusting. That's not what happened. What changed wasn't my warmth. It was my tolerance for imbalance. Before the estate situation, I believed that being easygoing was a virtue in itself. That minimizing conflict made me mature. That absorbing discomfort quietly was a form of strength. Now I understand something more precise. Peace without boundaries is not peace, it's compliance. For most of my life, I equated calmness with accommodation. I thought staying quiet made me gracious. I thought letting others lead, even when I had equal standing, made me generous. But generosity without consent becomes self-erasure. And self-erasure invites assumption. I didn't become confrontational after everything resolved. I didn't start challenging every comment or demanding proof in casual conversations. What I did change was internal. When someone says, "Don't worry, I've got it," I now ask, "Can you include me in the details?" When someone makes a decision that affects me, I don't wait to see if I'm invited into the process. I step in, calmly, directly, without apology. Daniel and I still speak. We still have Sunday dinners. The warmth hasn't vanished, but it's more balanced now. He consults me on financial matters instead of informing me afterward. He sends documentation without being prompted. Not because he's afraid of me, because he understands I am not optional in decisions that involve me. That shift didn't require dominance in the traditional sense. It required clarity. The biggest surprise, though, was how this changed my relationship with myself. There's a particular kind of exhaustion that comes from constantly being the reasonable one, from smoothing every edge, from being the emotional regulator in every room. I didn't realize how much energy that consumed until I stopped doing it automatically. Now, when I choose calm, it's intentional, not obligatory. When I choose silence, it's strategic, not submissive. That distinction matters. I don't regret giving Daniel the opportunity to correct himself through the process, rather than public exposure. I don't regret keeping my voice level. What I regret, if anything, is how long I mistook invisibility for virtue. Because here's what I know now. You can be kind and still require fairness. You can be calm and still demand accountability. You can love someone and still document their actions. Quiet dominance isn't about overpowering others. It's about fully occupying your own position. I am still the steady one, still measured, still thoughtful. But I am no longer the sister who can be calculated as low risk. And the most empowering part? I didn't have to become loud to be heard. If you've stayed with me this long, you might be expecting a dramatic moral, a warning about greedy relatives, a speech about betrayal, a declaration that you trust no one. That's not the lesson I took from this. My brother didn't see himself as a villain. He saw himself as efficient, capable, entitled to temporary flexibility because he was handling everything. And for a while, he was right about one thing. I was predictable. I was the sister who wouldn't push, the one who valued harmony, the one who would rather feel private discomfort than create public friction. He thought I'd walk away. Instead, I followed the money, not with anger, not with humiliation, not with revenge, with documentation, with patience, with structure. And that's the part I want you to sit with. When someone underestimates you, you have options. You can explode, you can withdraw, or you can recalibrate quietly and let the truth surface through the process. I didn't win because I outshouted him. I didn't win because I exposed him publicly. I won because I stopped confusing silence with weakness and started using it as a strategy. Fairness isn't loud. It's documented. It's patient. It's steady. If you're someone who has always been labeled the easy one, the calm one, the reasonable one, I want you to consider something gently. Are you choosing peace, or are you performing it? And if you stop performing it, what might change? I'd love to hear your thoughts. Have you ever been underestimated in a way that forced you to quietly redefine yourself?